after today, we actually have 1 week left in class. So today being the 25th, we've got lectures next Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. Then we've got the exam on Thursday. And then I've posted the extra credit assignment for those of you that are interested in doing that. Depending what your standing is in the class, right? I mean, obviously it can't hurt you at all, but as far as the impact it can have, I leave it up to you. The assignment that I gave you from the speaker, I think you'll enjoy it. He's an excellent speaker. He's probably one of the top authorities on cystic fibrosis. We didn't talk about cystic fibrosis because in this class, because the focus was on animals. But it is a very important disease that really there's a lot of physiological processes that are affected. And some of those processes affected involve certain transport mechanisms that we've spoken about, actually, as well as some that we haven't spoken about. So it's about a 1 hour video, and hopefully you guys get a lot out of it. And write a paper and just send it to me, and that's that. All right. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. Taking a look at the whiteboard. So today we're going to finish off the endocrine system. Monday we'll do digestive. We'll see how far we get through digestive. We may have some left on Tuesday. And then there's thermoregulation, which we'll see how far we can get into that. We're getting kind of short on time, but I want to make sure you guys get exposed to as much information as possible. The exam will be on July 2nd. I will be sending out some sort of a study guide. I got to write a note to myself this weekend so you guys can start preparing for the exam. It's going to be the same format, 50 questions, 100 points. All right. Okay, so today we're going to focus on the second half of the endocrine system. When I mean the second half is we covered a lot of basics, some terminology, classifications of hormones, how hormones work. And then we ended up looking at really a couple of the big players in the endocrine system. That would be the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. And we learned about the hormones that they produce, either hormones that are released that are stored in the posterior pituitary, or hormones that are released that travel into the anterior pituitary that can either stimulate or inhibit anterior pituitary hormones. So today we're going to get into more about the target organs, the thyroid gland, the adrenal gland, things like that. All right. So first thing I want to talk about is one of the target organs, and that is the adrenal gland. And the adrenal gland, it got its name because the term adrenal, renal means kidney, ad means on top of, and it actually sits on top of the kidney. The adrenal gland produces several different hormones, but we can collectively summarize their effect on regulating sugar and ion metabolism, as well as significantly the stress response. The anatomy of the adrenal gland, it's divided up into two parts. We have the outer part of the adrenal gland, which is known as the cortex. This part of the adrenal gland produces steroid hormones. We've learned about some of those, like aldosterone, for example. The inner portion is the medulla, and that produces what we call catecholamines. Those are the tyrosine-derived hormones such as epinephrine and norepinephrine, which of course you might remember are also part of the sympathetic nervous system. All right, so a little bit more detailed anatomy of the adrenal. This everything except this part. This is, of course, the medulla. This outer portion is the cortex. But within the cortex, we can actually divide it up into different zones. This outermost zone is known as the zona glomerulosa. And the function of this zone is that this is where aldosterone is produced. You remember, of course, aldosterone is crucial in promoting the sodium uptake from the kidneys by way of activation of sodium potassium ATPase, which pumps sodium back to help conserve it in the body. The middle portion is known as the zona fasciculata. This is where we see the production of, collectively they're called glucocorticoids. There are several different hormones depending on the animal, but the common one that we find in us is either cortisol or corticosterone. These hormones have a role in regulating glucose levels. Aldosterone is also known as a mineral corticoid because it does regulate minerals such as sodium and potassium. The innermost portion of the cortex is known as the zona reticularis, and interestingly, this is where we find androgenic hormones. Androgenic hormones are sex hormones associated with males, so testosterone-derived hormones. Remember I mentioned that the adrenal and the gonads are both derived from mesoderm, which explains why those are the only two organs where we see the production of steroids. The role that they play in terms of reproduction appears to be quite limited. There are certain pathologies that are associated with excessive production of androgens in this area, but nonetheless, that is the function of the zona reticularis. Then we go into these medulla, or the medulla portion of the adrenal gland. This is a part that interacts with the sympathetic nervous system in the sense that this part contains modified neurons that are responsible for producing epinephrine and norepinephrine into the blood. We'll take a closer look at this as far as how both of these regions are important in the stress response. All right. So when we go back taking a look at regulation, we've already spoken a lot about the hypothalamus, and we've spoken about the pituitary. And if you remember, the hypothalamus produces a hormone called CRH, which stimulates the anterior pituitary via that portal system to produce ACTH, and ACTH then travels into the blood to, in this case, travels to the adrenal cortex, specifically the zona fasciculata, where there are receptors, and this they trigger the release primarily of the glucocorticoids, or I would just say cortisol or corticosterone. This axis, we call it, between the hypothalamus, the pituitary, and the adrenal, it's called the HPA axis, hypothalamus, pituitary, and the adrenal. And there are certain disruptions in this axis that can occur. I'm not going to get into details, but with things like depression, anxiety, other post-traumatic stress syndrome, things like that. All right, so the glucocorticoids enter into the blood, and so what do? Well, a couple different things. Just to summarize, their main function is to increase the levels of blood sugar. This is an area this is a gland or a hormone that is secreted in response to stress primarily. So when you're under stress, right, the stress triggers the production of CRH, ACTH, and glucocorticoids. Now, what is stress? Stress to one person might be a minor inconvenience to somebody else, right? Someone might get stressed because they've got an expensive phone bill. Someone might not. So whatever it is, when your body perceives stress, it's going to trigger the production of CRH. Okay. This is also produced in a less dramatic form in response to circadian rhythms. The activity of this pathway is highest in the morning. So your cortisol levels are primarily highest in the morning, and as the day progresses, they decrease unless you're under some sort of major stress. All right, so getting back to the functions of glucocorticoids or cortisol from the zona fasciculata, the main role is to elevate blood sugar levels. Now, it does this in a couple different ways. Main way is via gluconeogenesis. Gluconeogenesis is the conversion of non-glucose molecules into glucose. For example, amino acids, by way of the breakdown of proteins that can be incorporated into making glucose. The breakdown of fats can be incorporated into the production of glucose. So protein breakdown, that's what catabolism is. Fat breakdown, converting fats into fatty acids, converting proteins into amino acids, all interact to increase blood sugar levels. And of course, why do we need increased blood sugar? We're dealing with stress. Stress is a very energy expensive behavior or response. So in order to deal with it, we need energy. Ironically, that same cortisol that does those things also suppresses the immune system. And you might be familiar with this if you think of what typically, when do you get sick? When do we get sick? A lot of times we get sick when we're under a lot of stress, whether it's academic stress, taking tests, family stress, other types of things like what's going on right now, right? That can make you vulnerable because your immune system's suppressed. Clinically, cortisol can be used effectively by people who are in pain, have a lot of inflammation in their back or maybe in their joints, and doctors can give them an injection of cortisol, which reduces the pain by suppressing the inflammation, suppressing the immune system. Now, this is fine acutely, but chronically, obviously, it can be a problem. So we don't want that. Ideally, when we have a stress response, you want cortisol levels to go up and then go down. You don't want it persistent. All right, so the effects of cortisol in response to stress, although, of course, levels do go up in the morning, but we're just going to focus on stress, promotes gluconeogenesis by increasing fat breakdown, which is called lipolysis, and protein catabolism or protein breakdown. The purpose of this is by breaking these down and assembling sugar. Sugar provides the energy, or the breakdown of sugar provides the energy to give us resistance to stress. It increases the amount of available energy. The other side of the coin, of course, is the suppression of the immune system, which has anti-inflammatory effects, but can slow down wound healing and can slow the resistance to disease, right? So again, it's one of these things that you think, why would the body do this? Why would the body respond this way and suppress the immune system? But again, it does suppress inflammation, which is something you don't want when you're dealing with stress. Something that wasn't on the previous slide, but has been well documented, is chronic exposure to or chronic production of cortisol affects the brain, specifically the hippocampus. Yeah, it can actually damage those neurons. And if you've taken any other either neuroscience or other maybe anatomy classes, you know that the hippocampus plays a role in memory. So this can affect memory. And I don't mean the occasional, like you can't remember where you left your keys because you're stressed. I mean really serious chronic people who have PTSD, other sorts of chronic life-altering events can actually affect the hippocampus. All right. So as long as we're talking about the stress response, I want to elaborate a bit more on the role of cortisol, or glucocorticoids, but also bring in the role of the sympathetic nervous system. All right. So here's our little stress response, kind of an explosive type of response. Typically, the first thing that happens, the acute effect is activation of the sympathetic system. And this causes a lot of the typical physiological effects that you experience. Increased heart rate, breathing deeper and faster, right? Primarily cardiovascular effects. I mean, there are some effects on increasing the available energy, right? But primarily cardiovascular effects. We pumping more blood, bringing in more oxygen to fuel those muscles, because the stress is a fight or flight response. The other response, which is later, and I don't want to say long time down the road, but within a short period after the sympathetic response, we see the activation of the CRH, the HPA axis, the hypothalamus, pituitary, adrenal axis. And that's where you have the glucocorticoids. Like I mentioned, they help to break down proteins, they help to break down fats, and we get an increase in the production of glucose. So a lot of stuff going on, but with the glucocorticoids, it primarily points in the direction of increasing available energy. With the sympathetic effects, there is some effect on increasing the available energy, but the primary role is on cardiovascular, delivering more blood, more oxygen, more nutrients to the muscles. So that's the zona fasciculata, obviously cortisol as well as the sympathetic. What about, remember, the zona glomerulosa produces aldosterone. So you've seen this any number of times on a different sort of slide. Remember, aldosterone is a steroid that responds to the stimulation by angiotensin II. Remember, it all starts with renin. The trigger for aldosterone, remember, is low blood pressure, low blood volume, which activates renin, which converts angiotensinogen into angiotensin 1. Angiotensin 1 gets converted into angiotensin 2 by ACE, which activate angiotensin 2, then activates aldosterone, which promotes sodium uptake. So that's what we call the RAA syndrome, renin, angiotensin, aldosterone. I'm not going to talk about the zona reticularis, just know that they are involved in the production of androgens, or male reproductive hormones. All right. So to elaborate on that renin, angiotensin, aldosterone, again, you've seen this before when we were talking about the kidney, but I found this neat little diagram, which I think hopefully puts it all together. Here's the kidney, of course, the afferent arteriole, the glomerulus. Here's the proximal tubule, distal tubule. Remember, in response to low blood pressure, these juxtaglomerular cells, also known as granular cells, I think I may have mentioned that, granular cells, produce renin, which enters into the blood, converts angiotensinogen into this, and you can kind of follow the path of how aldosterone increases sodium reabsorption. All these things happen, leading to an elevation of blood pressure. Of course, way back when we were talking about other functions of the kidney, remember we spoke about the macula densa cells that responds to high blood pressure by producing a hormone that causes constriction of the afferent arteriole. This responds to low blood pressure, the granular or juxtaglomerular cells. Moving from the adrenal to the thyroid. Thyroid gland has a lot of different functions. It's got a few different hormones. Two main groups of hormones I want to mention. The first one involves the production of what we call T3 and T4, which I'll talk about. Those two hormones are primarily involved in controlling growth, nervous system development, temperature, metabolism, and amphibian metamorphosis, I should say. The only one that's left is regulation of calcium levels, and that's controlled by a different hormone we'll learn about called calcitonin. So you can see where the thyroid is located. It's just located inferior to the larynx, right? Kind of sits on top of the trachea. Like I said, one of the functions of the thyroid hormones are metamorphosis. This is what I mean by metamorphosis. It takes about 40 days for a tadpole to go from its earliest stage all the way to its adult stage as a frog. And if you remove the thyroid gland from this tadpole, it'll grow into a very, very, very big tadpole. All right. So let's focus on T3 and T4. And if you remember when we were talking about the amines, how we're classifying hormones, remember T3 and T4 are also, they're amines, they're derived from tyrosine. The 3 and the 4 refer to the number of iodine atoms that are on them. So one of the reasons why you need to have iodine in your diet is iodine is incorporated into the production of T3 and T4. There's 3 iodine atoms on T3, 4 iodine atoms on T4. What is the target tissue? Thyroid hormones act on most tissues in the body. As opposed to, remember, aldosterone, right, acts on the kidney, right? Glucocorticoids act on basically on the liver, muscle, things like that. Thyroid gland, thyroid hormones affect everything. And the receptor for thyroid hormone is found inside the cell, in the mitochondria, and in the nucleus. We haven't spoken about mitochondrial receptors. One of the significant features of that is that, remember, the mitochondria plays a very important role in oxidative phosphorylation, production of ATP, right? So it makes sense that there would be receptors there. What are the general effects of thyroid hormones? Both T3 and T4, increased ATP production. And a lot of these overlap: increased cellular metabolism, energy utilization, oxygen consumption. Those are all related. A consequence of increased metabolism is increased body temperature. Remember when we were talking about the Bohr effect with the respiratory system and how increased activity of organs results in an elevated temperature, right? So it kind of fits into that. In the case of the Bohr effect, remember, higher temperature, more oxygen delivered. So increased body temperature. In addition to that, the thyroid gland also plays a very important role during fetal development and postnatal development, growth and development of not only the nervous system, but skeletal and muscular systems. So if a child is born hypothyroid, one of the things that can result is it can severely impact and affect the development of the bones, muscles, and nerves. All right, so when we talk about the endocrine system, one of the things we know when we're talking about diseases, there's 2 classes of diseases with the endocrine system. Either you produce too much of a hormone or you don't produce enough. This is true with the thyroid gland. One condition is called hyperthyroidism. You're producing too much thyroid hormone. There are several different causes. There's even an autoimmune type condition that can cause it, but we'll talk about that later. But because we know what thyroid hormone does, you can pretty much predict what elevated levels are going to do. They're going to increase metabolic rate, even some cardiovascular effects, increased body temperature, nervousness. Increased metabolism might lead to weight loss. So this is quite interesting. Someone might look at that. It's like, oh, wow, what a great diet pill, right? I just get prescription of thyroid hormone and lose weight. Unfortunately, people have done that when they don't need to. And as you can see, if you're not, if you have a normal thyroid condition, what can happen is you can cause a lot of these symptoms of hyperthyroidism. Yes, you might lose weight, but you're also going to potentially have some heart problems. So definitely it wouldn't be the way to go for weight loss, for going on a diet, right, or losing weight. Better to watch what you eat and other things. All right. Possible goiter. Goiter is actually an enlargement of the thyroid gland. Also, another characteristic of hyperthyroidism is exophthalmos. And if you think of when you go to an ophthalmologist, right, that's an eye doctor. This is when your eyes, and hopefully you can see it, basically your eyes can get kind of bulgy. Actually, I got to go back. I don't know if you can, I assume you can see me. Let me go back here for a second. Yeah, so your eyes get kind of bulgy like that. There's a well-known actor in the movie, some of the Mel Brooks movies. Young Frankenstein is a perfect one. Marty Feldman had that condition. And there's been a few other well-known people that have had it. It's due to fluid buildup and fatty tissue buildup behind the eye. So that's too much thyroid hormone. You can also have a condition when you're not making enough. And this will lead to the opposite effects: slower metabolic rate, even feeling tired, fatigued, slowing down heart rate, blood pressure, body temperature decreases. Quite often you might feel cold when you normally don't. Increased weight gain because your metabolism is decreased. You can even get goiter from this, and I'll explain how you can get goiter from both hypo and hyperthyroidism. Myxedemia, which is a subcutaneous swelling, hair loss, dry skin. Was actually diagnosed with hypothyroidism probably 15 years ago. And a lot of it came about because I was gaining weight. I was just tired all the time and cold, and I rarely get cold, just even if it's in the 50s or 60s. I just don't get cold. So fortunately, if you're diagnosed with hypothyroidism, you can be prescribed a pill. It's about the size of a baby aspirin, and it's a thyroid hormone. And every day I take that, I'll probably be taking it every day for the rest of my life. But it's helped tremendously. As I mentioned, hypothyroidism, either of the mother or the baby during pregnancy, early childhood, may lead to what's called cretinism. And that's when you have like this abnormal development. The brain may not develop properly, your structure, primarily skeletal, maybe muscle too, but it's primarily skeletal and nervous systems. All right. So some histology here, just to give you an idea of what the thyroid gland looks like. Very different from the adrenal gland. If you do a cross-section through this thyroid gland, you see these ringed arrangement of cells. These are all individual cells. These rings are known as follicles. Within each follicle, all these cells that line the follicle are called follicular cells. Those follicular cells are responsible for making T3 and T4, which here they are right here. And you can see with the iodine residues on them and how they're derived, of course, from tyrosine. If you're low in iodine, this can lead to hypothyroidism. There's other causes of it too, but one good source of iodine is seafood, whether it's seaweed or just seafood from the ocean. It typically has a higher level of iodine. So we've got follicular cells that make T3 and T4. While we're here, I'm going to mention the other hormone that's produced that affects calcium. And remember, of course, it's also T3 and T4 that are involved in amphibian metamorphosis. The other cell is called the C cell. And the C cell produces calcitonin. Calcitonin is responsible for regulating calcium. And it responds when calcium levels in the blood are high. And it moves calcium from the blood to places like the bone. And I'll show you some of the mechanisms of that. All right. So thyroid C cells produce the hormone calcitonin. The calcitonin helps to facilitate the transport of calcium from the blood if it's too high, moves it to the bone. This is all part of homeostasis, right? And as we'll soon see, there's also a hormone that moves calcium from the bone back to the blood if the blood calcium gets too low. All right, excuse me. All right, so there's another gland, interestingly, that sits on top of another gland. These are called the parathyroid glands. And the parathyroid glands, there are 4 of those, are embedded in the thyroid gland. This is a posterior view of the body. This is the thyroid gland. This is the backside. But you can see we have these little bean-shaped organs. These are parathyroid glands. They also control calcium homeostasis. What's interesting, what's really really important, is there are certain conditions where someone may have to have some or all of their thyroid gland removed, whether it's enlarged, tumor, growth, whatever. Doctors have to be very careful in the process of removing some of that thyroid. They don't also remove the parathyroid, because the parathyroid is equally as important. Its function is to increase blood calcium levels. Remember, calcitonin moves calcium from when the blood calcium gets too high, it moves it to the bone. When blood calcium gets too low, it's moved from other places due to parathyroid hormone. So let's take a look at it. So the net effect is to increase blood calcium. Parathyroid hormone helps to move calcium from the bone back to the blood. That makes sense, right? Because calcitonin moves calcium from the blood to the bone. So parathyroid moves it from the bone back to the blood. But there's other places that it acts too. Calcium can also be lost from the body through our urinary system and also through our digestive system. So parathyroid hormone, which is the hormone that's produced by the parathyroid gland, also acts to inhibit the kidney from excreting calcium. And it also acts on the intestine, which it doesn't show it right here, to increase the absorption of calcium from the intestine back into the blood. All right, so whereas calcitonin moves calcium specifically from the blood to the bone, when blood calcium levels get too high, when blood calcium levels get too low, there's 3 ways that it can be restored. One is through the bone, the breakdown of bone, dissolving of calcium to get to the blood, the inhibiting the excretion of calcium through the urine, and the absorption of calcium from the intestine back into the blood. The net effect is increasing blood calcium. So if we take a look at the summary of the dual effects of regulating calcium, remember we have calcitonin and we have parathyroid hormone, or PTH. What are the conditions that trigger their release? First of all, if calcium levels in the blood get too high, this triggers the parathyroid glands to release, the C cells of the thyroid gland to produce calcitonin. Calcitonin helps to move calcium, transporting it from the blood to the bone. Now, what happens if calcium levels get too low in the blood? Well, this will in turn activate the parathyroid hormones, which will, parathyroid glands, which will increase the levels of parathyroid hormones by way of what are called the chief cells, by the way. Remember, we have C cells and follicular cells. These are the chief cells, which help to move calcium from the intestine, bone, and kidneys back to the blood. So that pretty much summarizes the effects. This can kind of be a confusing slide, but this is kind of the summary of everything. Here is the response. When calcium levels get too low, we produce PTH. If the calcium levels get too high, we produce calcitonin. Don't worry about a lot of these details here. What I just really want you to focus is on these slides, this one right here. All right, so one of the things that I wanted to mention at this point, before we get into the next, is remember we've spoken about the hypothalamus and pituitary. and how they control certain organs, right? We already established that the hypothalamus pituitary also stimulates the release of glucocorticoids from the zona fasciculata. That's how it's regulated, right? Through the stress response. But remember aldosterone? The aldosterone, there's no HPA axis. There's no hypothalamic hormone that's stimulating. What triggers aldosterone is low blood pressure. What about calcitonin? And what about parathyroid hormone? They also are not influenced by the pituitary and hypothalamus. They're triggered or they're stimulated by levels of calcium. So those are the factors that influence them. All right. Continuing on. So we've taken a look at regulation of sodium. We've looked at regulation of calcium. Now let's take a look at the regulation of glucose. And now, granted, we've already spoken a bit about the regulation of glucose by cortisol at the zona fasciculata, but we need to take a look at a couple different conditions of regulating glucose. The increase in glucose as a result of cortisol production is primarily the result of stress response, right? The pancreas is also a gland, an organ that regulates the levels of glucose, but this is primarily due to influence of the diet when we're eating or when we're not eating, all right? Here's the pancreas. Within the pancreas, we have this kind of a clustered structure, almost looks like a glomerulus, but this is called the islets of Langerhans. Langerhans was the name of the person who discovered them. And this is the endocrine part of the pancreas. The pancreas also plays a very important role in digestion, which we'll learn about later. That's these other cells around it. But the endocrine cells are confined to what are called the islets. And they produce several different several different hormones. But I primarily want to focus on two cells. Number one, the alpha cells, which make glucagon, and the beta cells, which make some amylin, but I'm more focused on insulin. So we're going to look really at insulin and glucagon, how they regulate blood sugar. Oops. All right. So if you take a look at when you're eating, whether you've just eaten or whether you're fasting, right, that is going to affect your levels of blood sugar. If you've just eaten a meal, nutrients pass through your gut or absorbed from the intestine, go into the blood sugar levels are going to go up, right? If you haven't eaten in a while, blood sugar levels are going to go down, all right? When blood sugar levels go up, this activates the beta cell. When blood sugar levels go down, this activates the alpha cell. Now, what is the byproduct of this? The byproduct of the beta cell is insulin. So blood sugar levels go up, the beta cells stimulate insulin. When blood sugar levels go down, the alpha cells stimulate glucagon. And the net effect, much we learned about homeostasis, this should reverse things, right? When blood sugar goes up, the goal of insulin is to lower blood sugar back to normal, moving glucose into the body tissues, out of the blood. With glucagon, when your blood sugar levels are low, this helps to liberate or to release glucose that's stored in tissue into the blood. So there's this constant interplay, right, in our bodies. Normally kind of a nice little balance, a yin and a yang, much like we saw with calcitonin, parathyroid hormone. All right. So like I said, insulin increases after a meal, right? Sometimes it's called the fed state. We've just eaten. And what I want you to know, of course, is insulin targets a lot of tissue. The net effect is that we're moving glucose and other nutrients into the tissues. So we're moving glucose, even though the focus is on glucose with insulin, we're really looking at the movement of other nutrients as well. So what's going to happen? We move glucose, we increase fat production, protein synthesis, in the tissues. All right, so what am I getting at? When nutrients are in the blood after you've absorbed them from your gut, they're already broken down. What insulin does, it helps to move all those broken down nutrients like amino acids, fatty acids, and glucose, moves those into the tissues where they can be reassembled for storage into things like glycogen, fat, and protein. This is what we call an anabolic effect, as opposed to catabolic. Catabolic is when you're breaking down these large nutrients, like building blocks, right? Anabolic is when you're putting building blocks together. So insulin does that. It moves stuff out of the blood. In contrast, glucagon is elevated during what we call the fasted state. Now, when I say fasting, this doesn't necessarily mean it occurs during prolonged fasting, like religious observance, although it can happen then. But it also can occur, say you had breakfast at 7, you haven't had lunch yet, it's 1 o'clock, and you're still working, right? Whether going to school or whatever, glucagon's working to elevate blood sugar levels. So it does this by breaking down glycogen, breaking down fats, breaking down proteins, and to help elevate the nutrients in the blood. This is what we call a catabolic tissue, catabolic effect. So it's low blood plasma glucose before, after glucagon, due to the breakdown of all these stored nutrients in our tissues, they're broken down, released into the blood. Now we have elevated plasma glucose and other nutrients, right? Here we had high levels of nutrients in the blood. Due to insulin, they're pulled into the tissues where they're stored away in these large molecules. They're saved for a rainy day whenever we need them. All right. Moving on to another gland known as the pineal gland. And the pineal gland is actually located in the geographical center of the brain. A lot of interesting history with this gland. I'm not going to ask you to know it, but there was a time when it was thought to have a spiritual significance, regulating our balance of the 4 humors, blood, bile, all those, spiritual awakening. Then it got to the point where it was thought that it was just a vestigial organ, didn't have any known function. It wasn't until melatonin was actually discovered in 1957 and they looked at when melatonin is produced and everything, that it was found that this melatonin, which is the hormone of the pineal, plays a very important role in circadian rhythms, regulating our day-to-day body clock. And that's just not the sleep-wake cycle. That is that enzymes in your body become active before a meal, that certain things are activated at different times of day. That's all coordinated. A lot of this is coordinated through melatonin. This is, remember, an amine. It's a tryptophan-derived hormone. In animals, some animals, especially animals that live in the wild, melatonin also coordinates their seasonal breeding. Now, unlike humans and some animals that can breed year-round, many animals do not breed year-round. There's only certain times of the year when they breed. And the purpose of that is to ensure that when the offspring are born, they're born at a time of year that's conducive for their survival. If you're looking at grazers, right, animals that eat grasses and things, you want to make sure that the animals are born in the spring, right? That's why deer and sheep in the northern hemisphere, for example, they start breeding in the fall. They have about a 6-month gestation. The young are born in the spring. This is all coordinated through melatonin. This last one, I put a question mark, and I probably should take the question mark away because I think it's pretty convincing. It appears that melatonin may have a very important role in cancer. Not in cancer, but inhibiting growth of cancer cells. I'm going to give you a name of somebody. And let me go back for a second. He's actually a really good friend of mine. We were colleagues at the University of Arizona. Now he's at Tulane. if anyone's really interested in learning about melatonin and how it's been implicated in suppressing tumor growth, look him up, Lane University. I wish I had more time to discuss it, but I'll just put down oncostatic melatonin. And even if you email, if you're able to get a hold of his email address, he's very good at responding. But anyway, let me go back to the new share. Yeah, so I'm just going to mention this briefly. Again, you don't have to know this part, but it's been found, for example, that we normally have the circadian rhythm, right? We're exposed to light during the day, and at night there's darkness, and this induces sleep, right? And melatonin is actually stimulated by darkness. Well, certain people have jobs where they work at night, and they're exposed to light at night. And they've been found that there's an increased incidence of certain cancers in people that work around light. It doesn't have to be sunlight. It can be any light, fluorescent light, incandescent, whatever. Now, a good example of that, I hate to mention to you guys, of course, but working in clinical areas, whether it's nursing or even physicians, sometimes you guys have to work at night around lights. And they found increased incidence of certain cancers. Now, having said that, I want to immediately tell you guys that doesn't mean that you're going to get cancer working in that field, okay? Some people are more predisposed than others, but it's been highly recommended that, say, if you work at night around a lighted area, when you do come home to sleep, make sure your sleep area is completely dark. So the idea is that as long as you have some melatonin being produced, even if you work at night and you come home during the day when it's normally light outside, right? If you darken your room, you're going to start producing melatonin. And that will help keep things in check. So you can look this up. Dave Blask, you can look a lot of the research being done on that, him and as well as others. But it's been found to kind of be effective. Another thing is red light actually suppresses, red light can stimulate the production of melatonin. So if you're working in a red light environment, which not too many hospitals do that, that would work. Also blue light, which if you those of you guys that use your cell phones or looking at a screen at night, that's blue light. That suppresses melatonin. So if you ever wonder why sometimes it's difficult for you to go to sleep after you've been on your computer, yeah, it could be that your head's just all wound up with what you were looking at, but it also has to do with the fact that you've essentially shut down your melatonin production for a while. All right, I'm going off on a tangent here. All right, last organ. Not last organ. What am I talking about? One of the last organs I want to mention is the heart. And again, here we're revisiting something we discussed at the kidney during the kidney topic. But the hormone is ANP, atrial natriuretic peptide. It's produced by the atria of the heart in response to high blood pressure. And what it does, it basically antagonizes the response that we saw when we had low blood pressure. So remember, of course, aldosterone levels go up to increase salt uptake. Vasopressin levels go up to increase water, all those things, right? Building up blood volume. If the blood volume gets too high, ANP kicks in and we shut down aldosterone, we shut down vasopressin, and everything that was produced in response to the low blood pressure is shut down. So the whole idea is that we end up excreting more. We end up excreting more sodium and water as opposed to absorbing it. All right. And this is basically the same thing. ANP decreases sodium and water reabsorption, which ultimately will increase sodium and water excretion, which will reduce blood pressure and blood volume. All right. So we've spoken most of the semester about vertebrates, right? But we've spoken a little bit about insects. We talk about spiracles and trachea and how they breathe. But I do want to talk a little bit about the endocrine system of insects. And unfortunately, just the short period is not really enough to grasp everything about insect endocrinology. But what I do want to focus on are the hormones that are involved specifically in the metamorphosis of insects. Okay, so this is an example of a couple different insects and how they develop. This is one type of insect where we call this hemimetabolous development. This is what's called holometabolous, which this is like the typical caterpillar to a butterfly metamorphosis, and this is what we're going to focus on. So you'll notice with the holometabolous pathway, it starts off from larvae, then evolves into pupae, and then adult. So how does this occur? Okay, well, hormones again, right? So in these little critters, little insects, they've got some glands. And one of the glands they have is called the corpus cardiacum. So this would be kind of where the brain is, the brain area. This is a region of the larval brain, the caterpillar brain, that produces a hormone called PTTH, called prothoracicotropic hormone, PTTH. This is almost like a hypothalamic pituitary system, although it's quite different, but it's kind of the same as in the sense that one hormone stimulates another. PTTH travels to what's called the prothoracic gland and stimulates that gland to make a hormone called ecdysone. Now, ecdysone is a hormone that's produced pretty much throughout the life of a developing insect. The levels don't really change much. It's kind of more of a sustaining level, stays pretty level. What really is involved, so that doesn't really tell us anything about metamorphosis, right? These are just PTTH stimulates ecdysone, which basically helps to maintain these different parts of development. However, what's actually responsible for triggering the change? That's a hormone called juvenile hormone. And it's the levels of juvenile hormone that determine when and how quickly a larva will transform into a pupa and a pupa into an adult. During the early larval stage, juvenile hormone levels are very high. And basically, this keeps the larva in a juvenile state. As it starts to develop a little bit, the juvenile hormone levels drop, or it's really the slight drop in juvenile hormone levels that allow it to become a later stage larvae. As the levels drop even more, it transforms into a pupa. And once juvenile hormone levels completely are diminished, the pupa transforms, into an adult. All right, so let me show you a couple more pictures about that. First of all, to give you an idea of hormones, talk about evolutionary conservation. Here is ecdysone is actually a steroid derived from cholesterol. And juvenile hormone is what's called a terpene. It's another organic molecule. They're both lipid soluble, so they easily cross membranes. All right. So I like this diagram because this pretty much kind of summarizes the big picture here. So if you take a look, here we've got the larva, the early larva, all the way to the late larva, the pupa, and the adult. If we look at the levels of ecdysone, remember ecdysone? And if you look at sort of the density of ecdysone stays about the same in all the different stages of development. If we take a look at juvenile hormone, you notice how high it is in the beginning, and then it gradually gets less and less and less, forming a pupa, and then basically there's no juvenile hormone, and this releases the pupa into being able to transform into an adult. Think of the juvenile hormone as sort of like a hormone that keeps something in more of a child state, right? And what's interesting about this from a kind of current issues, those of you that have pets, particularly dogs, because I've had dogs. The old way of killing fleas was flea spray or flea powder, right? Which is nasty stuff. It's got some other side effects. Well, now they have these compounds. You can go get them like Program, Advantage. I can't remember some of the other names. Frontline. Those medications are what are called insect growth regulators. And those are compounds that mimic the juvenile hormone. So what do? Say if you've got flea eggs on your pet, those flea eggs will never mature. And as a result, by not maturing, your dog won't get any flea bites. So it basically prevents it from maturing, which is kind of a cool way. It's very specific, and it doesn't have any side effects on people that are exposed to it, like pesticides. All right. Last thing, let's see how we're doing here. Oh, okay, we're doing good. Okay. All right. So now we're at the tail end of the endocrine system. And what I want to talk about are a little bit more detail about endocrinopathies. These are diseases associated with the endocrine system. I've already given you some examples, but to go into a little bit more detail, endocrinopathies can be divided up into diseases where the gland is not producing enough. This would be like a hypothyroid condition. It can be type 1 diabetes, where the pancreas is not making enough insulin. It can be what's called Addison's disease, where the adrenal is not making enough cortisol. So low cortisol, low insulin, low thyroid. We can also have hypersecretion, where what's called Graves' disease can cause the thyroid gland to make too much thyroid hormone. We can have Cushing's disease, where the adrenal cortex is making too much cortisol. So both of these are cortisol, right? So that's acting on the zona fasciculata. Pituitary tumors. There's many types of tumors, but there's a couple specifically that result in too much growth hormone, which is what we call acromegaly, and too much prolactin, prolactinoma. So these are examples of either too much hormone or not enough. So let's take a look at some in particular. All right. Let's take a look at Cushing's disease. Remember I mentioned Cushing's is a result of too much cortisol. So what's interesting about this is you think of, well, why is it making too much cortisol? We know that the adrenal gland, or at least cortisol, is under the control of the pituitary, which is also under the control of the hypothalamus. So is the problem at the adrenal, or is the problem at the pituitary or the hypothalamus? If the problem is at the hypothalamus, at the adrenal, say there's a defect, scarring or some sort of damage at the adrenal that's causing elevated levels of cortisol. Did I say decrease? Yeah, it should be elevated levels of cortisol. So if too much cortisol is due to the fact that we have a tumor of the adrenal, that's called primary Cushing's. If the excessive production of cortisol is due to too much ACTH, maybe a tumor of the pituitary, that's what we call secondary hypersecretion. If the problem is due to an overactivity of the hypothalamus, you would think this would be called tertiary, but it's still called secondary. So anytime you've got an organ involved that's not, in this case, the adrenal, it's going to be secondary. And you can have the same thing even with thyroid glands, right? If you have hypothyroidism, it can be due to the thyroid gland, it can be due to the pituitary, it can be due to the hypothalamus. All right. Acromegaly. So acromegaly is when someone has a tumor of the pituitary gland that not only causes them to grow tall, but basically into adulthood, but even growing beyond adulthood, affecting other body features. This right here is the same woman several years apart. Here she looks relatively healthy, but you can see what happened over time as that tumor grew. It affected, look at the size of her chin, her forehead, maybe either where her eyes are, her nose, and even looking at the hands, right? This was actually a person, unfortunately he's no longer alive. He lived for a while. He was a Ukrainian who at the time was the world's tallest man. He was 8'5", 440, and he had a condition in which he was making too much growth hormone. What they said, the data said that he had an operation that stimulated the overproduction of growth hormone. And I don't know, I mean, I'm just reading what they said. I don't know how that can be. If the operation can stimulate it, I could see if the person had a tumor that can do it. But anyway, too much growth hormone is going to lead to someone who's too tall and also other conditions. Definitely, typically the lifespan is shorter in those people because all the other organs will enlarge as well. The heart would enlarge, other organs that can actually put a lot of pressure on other body functions. Thyroid gland. Okay, so remember I mentioned that the thyroid gland, you could have either, if you have a pathology, it could either be due to not enough thyroid hormone or too much. And you can get a goiter from both, okay? Well, in this section, we haven't spoken a lot about feedback loops. I think in the first lecture we spoke about it, and hormones do utilize feedback loops. If we take a look, first of all, at the enlargement or the goiter of a thyroid gland in response to what we call Graves' disease. Remember, Graves' disease, which is right here, is a hypersecretion. So why does the thyroid gland get bigger? It gets bigger, first of all, it's caused by an autoimmune condition where the body has made antibodies that stimulate the thyroid gland. This is not due to TSH at all. This is specifically due to antibodies that are acting like TSH, and they're chronically stimulating the thyroid. They're not stimulating it when it needs it, they're stimulating it all the time, 24/7, right? So the thyroid gland is going to enlarge. Normally what happens is when a hormone's produced, it feeds back on the pituitary and hypothalamus to kind of slow them down. That's normally what happens. When a person has hypothyroidism, and this can be due to maybe low iodine in diet, right? Everything's working properly. The hypothalamus is working properly, the pituitary, but we're unable to make thyroid hormone. Unable to make thyroid hormone. So there's no iodine. So no T3 and T4. So there's no feedback to inhibit TSH, because normally T3, T4 will inhibit TSH. Because it's not inhibiting TSH, the thyroid is constantly getting pounded by TSH. So it's growing. So we can have this enlargement or goiter by this autoimmune condition, chronically stimulating the thyroid. We can also get goiter, this enlargement, in a hypothyroid condition because there's no feedback inhibition to slow down TSH. This is just showing Graves' disease, this enlargement. It's an autoimmune condition. So this would be normal thyroid. This would be a goiter condition. All right. Last thing I want to talk about, and I wish I had more time because this topic can encompass a couple lectures easily, and that's diabetes. And many of you are already familiar with the fact that there's more than one type of diabetes. When we think of diabetes, we think of problems with insulin. Well, there's two types, type 1 and type 2. Type 2 is when the pancreas, those beta cells, are not making enough insulin. They're making any at all. So as you can imagine, if insulin, the main function of insulin is to move nutrients into the tissues, not only are the tissues starving, but the blood is flooded with nutrients. So it's interesting. The tissues are starving, but there's the sea of nutrients floating around in the blood, but it's not getting to the tissues. Then there's type 2, where, at least in the early stages, the pancreas is producing insulin, but due to a defect in the insulin receptor, in many cases on a different tissue, the tissues are unable to respond. This is what we call insulin resistance. And the consequences are the same. In both cases, you're going to get hyperglycemia and a lot of the complications associated with diabetes. Now, the condition that the most common type of diabetes in this country is type 2 diabetes. About 90% of the people who have diabetes have type 2. Good news in some sense is type 2 can in large part be reversed or prevented by diet and exercise. Okay. And that's good. Like, for example, obesity is a predisposing factor. Okay, if you can just hold on a second. Let's pause this for a second. That was my son. All right. So where were we? Let's see. Go back to share screen. All right. Signs and symptoms. So we went back here first of all. Let's go back. Why is that doing that to me? There we go. Okay. So let's talk about some of the characteristics of diabetes. Signs and symptoms of diabetes. And this can be both type 1 and type 2. This is all the result of elevated blood sugar. Fatigue and weight loss. Now, even though someone might be predisposed to getting diabetes because they're obese, chronic diabetes can lead to substantial weight loss. And this is because the tissues are starving, right? You've got all this glucose in the blood, but they're not getting into the tissues. So they're not getting the energy, you're getting tired. The next three, excessive thirst, called polydipsia, excessive hunger, polyphagia, excessive urination, polyuria, are all related, okay? Remember I mentioned with diabetes when we were talking about the kidney that if your blood sugar levels are too high, it'll spill over into the urine. Remember, normally the clearance rate of glucose is 0, but remember I mentioned that if the levels are so high that you exceed the saturation point of the SGLT, you're going to get glucose in the urine, right? Well, when glucose spills into the urine, water is going to follow, right? So you're going to pee more. Because you're losing sugar, because it's not getting to the tissues, and because you're losing it, you're going to be hungry. And because you're losing a lot more water, you're going to be thirsty. So those are all contributing symptoms of diabetes mellitus. The next three, tingling, numbness in extremities, persistent infections, and blurred vision, those are all related to vascular complications of diabetes. So diabetes is really a systemic disease, right? It affects, it's not just like a blood sugar levels go up and whatever. It affects everything. And actually, most people who die from diabetes die because of cardiovascular disease. The reason for that is buildup of sugar in the blood irritates the lining of the blood vessels, that tunica intima. And as they irritate the lining gets rough and other stuff sticks to it, like plaque. Think of like Velcro, right? Sticks to it. And what happens is next thing you know, your circulation is not as good as it was. And so this is going to cause tingling, numbness in your extremities, primarily your legs. Your nerves are not getting the blood supply, your muscles, you're getting numbness. And because of that poor circulation due to like the plaque buildup, this is also going to predispose you to getting chronic infections because delivery of white blood cells to the area is going to be impaired because of the poor circulation. So really serious vascular problems. Blurred vision, it's called diabetic retinopathy. That's due to damage to blood vessels behind the eye. So there's a lot of vascular problems, vascular complications of diabetes. Okay, elevated blood sugar causes, so just to elaborate on it, neuropathy. So that tingling, stuff like that effect, that's a neuropathy that's due to poor circulation, which affects the nerve function. It also affects, again, causes blood vessel damage. They get built up with plaque. They can get leaky. Because they get leaky and there's poor circulation, wound healing is slowed. And also, too, you can actually get gangrene, especially in the feet. Some of you that are familiar with people that are diabetic, who's ever taken care of them often has to look at their feet because that's the most peripheral part of the body, one of the most peripheral. And if you have poor circulation, poor sensation, someone can have an injury or maybe a cut or whatever, and they may not realize that it's infected. And by the time they realize it, they can get gangrene. In fact, in the old days, it wasn't that uncommon for people to have their limbs amputated from diabetes. So these are all the complications, many of the complications of diabetes. And you can see a lot of them are related to cardiovascular effects. All right. Okay, let's stop share. All right. So that takes us to the end of the lecture. Today is what, Thursday? All right. So over the weekend, I'm going to be, if no one has any questions, if you do, let me just take a look and see if anyone has any questions. No chat, no. If you do, you can ask me now, email me. Otherwise, over the weekend, I'll be sending out a study guide for our last exam, which is going to be on July 2nd. On Monday is our next topic is digestion. So that takes us to the end of the endocrine system, and I will see you guys on Monday.